Hi, if you're just joining us, we're going to take just a few minutes or a few seconds really to fill the room, and then we will get started. If you're just joining us on Zoom, and I see we're live on Facebook now, we're going to wait just a couple more seconds so that the room can fill up, and then we will get going. All right, we might be hitting our critical mass here, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's AJC Campus Crash Course, Fighting Anti-Semitism While Protecting Free Speech on Campus. My name is Zev Hurwitz, and I am the Director of AJC's Campus Affairs Department. A lot of the work we do is geared at combating anti-Semitism on college campuses while continuously promoting open discourse on critical issues. As an organization that champions democratic values, we are staunch defenders of the First Amendment while working to pursue a campus space that's free of hate speech. Today, we'll be discussing the areas where those two overlap and how public policy may help guide our work to eliminate anti-Semitism from campus. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined by AJC's Chief Legal Officer, Marc and AJC's U.S. Director for Combating Antisemitism, Holly Huffnagle, to answer these pressing questions about freedom of speech and anti-Semitic instigators on campus. There will be time at the end of today's session for Q&A. To submit questions for the Q&A, please send an email with your question to campus@ajc.org. Again, that's an email to campus@ajc.org. And then we can go ahead and get started. Marc, Holly, thank you so much for joining us today.
Welcome.
We're going to dive right in. Marc, let's talk about Title VI. Last December, the Trump administration had an executive order go out that was, now I don't want to give too much away, but it was about protecting Jewish students on campus and combating anti-Semitism in the campus space. There was a lot of controversy about that executive order, what it did, what it didn't do. So tell us what that executive order was and who it was intended to help and what it's actually doing. And for folks at home that want to follow along, we created a tiny, so if you go to tinyurl.com/campusEO, read the exact text of the Trump executive order while we discuss it. So Marc, walk us through the Trump executive order.
Okay. The Trump executive order did far less than the controversy justified. But to understand the Trump executive order, you have to go back to 1964. In 1964, it was a very different world, and many institutions and governments in the South particularly were taking federal money and engaging in outright discrimination. Congress in that year passed a monumental and landmark civil rights law, one of whose parts, known in legalese as Title VI, said that if you took government money, you could not discriminate on the basis of race, national origin, or ethnicity. Sex was not yet on the table. Sex is added to this list in 1972. Religion, however, was omitted. If you look at other parts of 1964 Civil Rights Act, including probably the most significant part, which is, or at least in historical perspective, at the time that part about school desegregation was most important. But now, looking back, the most important point was Title VII, which bans employment discrimination. And the employment discrimination ban includes discrimination based on religion. So why was religion left out of Title VI? Well, it wasn't a mistake. In 1964, Congress was concerned that if they included religion in Title VI, all those social service agencies run by religious institutions, which preferred members of their own faith in admissions, nursing homes, less hospitals, but nursing homes particularly, would be disqualified from taking government money, including Medicare and Medicaid already by 1964, 65, those are on the horizon, and Hill-Burton funds to build those facilities. And they persuaded Congress, the religious groups persuaded Congress to leave religion out. And that's where the law stood for many years till the beginning of the 21st century. And it didn't really make a whole lot of difference to anybody. In 2000, the early 2000, the courts, I'm told they call them, Jewish community began to experience a fair amount of anti-Semitism on campus. And while other groups had civil rights law available to protect them when they encountered racism or bigotry or misogyny on campus, Jews were left out. And let's go back and figure out why. it's not only that, it's not that by 2000 Jews were being excluded from classes or admission. That wasn't the problem. The problem was a secondary theory about what Title VI banned. Originally, Title VI, Congress had in front of it hospitals, nursing homes, other federally funded things that didn't accept blacks. That was easy. We found out as time went on that you could admit people and then make their life so miserable that they didn't want to stay. Imagine you're a black student admitted in 1966 to some university, and at every turn, people make remarks about your skin color. Well, you're not going to stay at that university. So it's tantamount to excluding you without doing so. And that's the theory of hostile environment. It's mostly known now for its impact on women. And so those theories were around for racial discrimination, gender discrimination, national origin discrimination. That left the Jews out in the cold because Jews are normally thought of in American thought. And this is product of a lot of work by American Jews over a long period of time, not as a national origin group, not as an ethnicity, but as a religious group. In the early 2000s, many of the major Jewish groups approached then the Bush administration's Department of Education and said, look, on college campuses, we're facing a hostile environment and we can't, under current regulations, nothing we can do about it, at least at the federal level, because religion isn't covered. But it's a fairly obvious fact that Jews are not only a religious group, but an ethnic group. In fact, in many recent polls, many Jews identify themselves as an ethnic group or ethnically Jewish, not religiously Jewish. And after a good deal of back and forth, the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights agreed that in theory, they could apply Title VI in that way, and they sent out a letter to that effect. The Bush administration, 8 years are up. The Obama administration comes in. There's a fair amount of pushback, both within the administration and from outside, saying this is not right. Jews are not an ethnic group, and this is about suppressing anti-Israel speech. It came mostly from the latter, not the former motivation. And the administration looked at the issue, and in 2010, reaffirmed the position of the department, which the Department of Justice reaffirmed the Department of Education's position, that Jews could also be considered an ethnic group. They said, well, not everything that's said about Jews will qualify as an ethnic group. If, for instance, somebody was to poke fun at Jews because they ate only matzah on Passover, that would be religious discrimination, and that Congress has excluded that. But if you say all Jews are money hungry, that's directed more to Jews as a national origin group or an ethnicity, and that in theory is covered. Everything will depend, said the Department of Justice, on the facts of any particular case, but in theory, that's where we are. That's where things stood. There were very few, if any, successful cases all these years. It had interim effect. We're able to take it to university presidents and say, look, you can either help us or we go to the Department of Education, which they don't want. So it was useful that way. About 2 years ago, the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, which enforces these rules, said we were going to apply something called the International Holocaust Memorial Association Definition of Antisemitism, which Holly is going to go into in greater detail, in assessing these cases. And there was no great blowback about that. Last December, out of the blue, we got an executive order that said, Department of Education, when you consider these complaints, you should consider, not you must apply, but you should consider whether the international definition is a helpful tool in deciding these cases. Now, that wasn't much. And there was legislation pending in Congress with bipartisan support that would have mandated they do that. So the administration's executive order did less than Congress was contemplating in legislation. Nevertheless, there was a big blow up. Much of it, frankly, was ignorant. It's not the first time that Jews had been defined as a national origin group. Indeed, Jews themselves said you should consider us such as early as the early 2000s for precisely this purpose. So Trump administration didn't do anything in the executive order, didn't do anything that hadn't been done at the behest of the Jewish community, nor did it mandate the use of the IRA definition in any particular case or any particular result. So it's hard to know what all the fuss is about in terms of criticism. Much of it is because people don't trust the Trump administration altogether, but it's less about the merits of the order. And I've now talked too long, and I'm going to give Holly a chance to explain what I'm talking about when I refer to the IRA definition.
Thanks, Mark. And Holly, please, I mean, what is IRA? What is the working definition? Where is it coming from? And then thinking about the hinting at IRA within the Trump executive order, what is the purpose of having a centralized definition of anti-Semitism? And for folks at home that want to check out the IRA definition while Holly talks about it, you can head to tinyurl.com/working definition. And that's the link to the IRA page with the actual definition.
The trick to finding it, if you're Googling, is to remember there's an H in IRA.
Holly, go ahead.
Thank you, Zev. Thank you, Mark. This is like the big question is the origin of this definition. So I actually want to take us back a couple of decades when there actually was not a working definition of anti-Semitism. The general consensus was that anti-Semitism was easily recognizable, right? It was desecrating Jewish cemeteries with swastikas. That was anti-Semitism. Charging Jews for the murder of Christ. That was anti-Semitism. Conspiracy theories pulled right out of the protocols of the elders of Zion. That was anti-Semitism. But in the early 2000s, there was this resurgence of anti-Semitism. We talked about it on college campuses, but also in Europe, that differed from the traditional understanding of the term. So while far-right, traditional, xenophobic anti-Semitism still existed, Jews were now being attacked as agents of Israel. So Jewish sites were being vandalized, and the responses were, oh, it's just youthful vandalism. Oh, it's a political action. But it wasn't anti-Semitism. There were anti-Israel protests where the protesters would shout, slaughter the Jews, right? And it wasn't categorized as anti-Semitic. There were Jewish synagogues being attacked or even firebombed, a house of worship for the actions of a nation state of Israel. And it wasn't being called anti-Semitic. They might be criminalized as arson or vandalism, but that anti-Semitism charge wasn't there, as if somehow anger toward Israel explained harassing Jewish worshipers or Jewish school children. So something had to be done. And this is really when organizations kind of came together, and AJC actually led the charge in crafting something called a working definition of anti-Semitism, which would include examples of how anti-Semitism could manifest. And one thing I'll say which is really important is that this was done actually by a body, an apolitical, nonpartisan body of policy experts, scholars, researchers that crafted this definition. And so today we see it being kind of politicized, even weaponized, and that was not at all the original intent of the definition. It should also be said that this definition is not legally binding, and it's meant to be an educational tool. So what do I mean by an educational tool? Well, it was meant to help police, prosecutors, and judges to determine an anti-Semitic motive when anti-Semitism is a factor in criminal acts. It was meant to be used by educators. It was meant to improve monitors and data collectors. So if we look back even to the European context, most European countries didn't even have a definition of anti-Semitism, and the ones that did, they were very different from each other. So if you wanted to, figure out what is the state of anti-Semitism in Europe, it was like comparing apples and oranges because it differed by country and country. So this was kind of a uniform definition to help find that data. I won't go into the transition of organizations and who adopted it, but fast forward to May of 2016, this working definition was slightly tweaked, and it was adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or the IHRA or IRA, and it was a 31-member body at the time. I think now there's 34 members, and they adopted this definition to be used. And now that's why we actually call it the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And the last thing I'll say, Zev, is to your point about the universal acceptance. So to date, the IRA definition is the most comprehensive, authoritative definition we have on anti-Semitism. It's actually been formally adopted by 38 countries and multilateral organizations all around the world.
Thanks, Holly. And bringing this conversation back to campus, and before I ask the next question, a reminder that if you have questions, please send them to questions or campus@ajc.org. Marc, free speech on campus, is there any sort of limitation as to what that, is there any regulation there? If students have a right to free speech, does that mean you can say whatever you want, whenever you want on a college campus, or are there restrictions in place?
Well, so first of all, we have to draw a distinction between public and private universities. Public universities are uniformly subject to the First Amendment, which says that Congress, which we now understand to mean government, shall make no law and then restricting the freedom of speech. Private universities are not bound by the First Amendment, nor in most places are they bound by state constitutions. So they are, in theory, free to do whatever they want. Most universities, however, in their catalogs, bind themselves to respect academic freedom. So you may not have a constitutional right, you may have a contractual right. It's weaker probably, but you have a contractual right to freedom of speech. And in fact, most universities, in theory, respect freedom of speech, unless it's something the president really cares about, in which case, less so.
The president
of the university really cares about, then less so. What freedom of speech protects is very much in this area a hotly contested subject. And let me take it away from anti-Semitism for a moment and turn to race. What I think of as many years ago, it probably wasn't all that many, conservative students at Dartmouth wanted to protest affirmative action. So they had a bake sale. They had chocolate brownies and blondies. I think this is when I first found out that there was such a thing as blondies. And to indicate that they thought that Black students who were admitted under affirmative action had less merit than white students, they charged less for the chocolate brownies than they did for the blondies. Of course, this was regarded as hugely insulting to the Black population at Dartmouth, understandably so. Now, would that qualify as a Title VI violation? Now, again, we talked about a hostile environment. So people who would complain would say there's a hostile environment. We can't walk. Everybody thinks we're inferior. The conservative students who ran the thing said, this is just freedom of speech. You don't like our criticism of affirmative action? Too bad. Freedom of speech says you have to tolerate speech. That issue has never fully been resolved. It comes up in the women's rights context as well. Nobody knows exactly what those borders are. Most of the cases that get litigated don't really raise the issue in very stark form. Most of the sexual harassment cases are about comments about women's bodies that are not about ideas in any cognizable fashion, or they're directed at a particular woman or man. So they fall into a sort of harassment category. What makes the issue a real issue in the anti-Semitism context is some of what's said is arguably political. If I'm the only Jew on campus, and I get phone calls in the middle of the night, and I'm called the bloodsucker, and we killed children for matzahs and Catholic Bible, that would fall under the harassment. What we're talking about today is mostly stuff that has some political veneer to it. It may not be politically veneer, it may not be obvious, but there is some political context to it. So that's why there's a question how far the government can go in order to make people feel at home in a federally funded program to suppress or limit speech that has some political context to it. And that's very much an open issue in our society at large. So there are some questions at the margins, what can be protected? There are, I think, on the other hand, things that a lot of Jews find very discomforting that are clearly going to be political speech, and the courts have agreed. Several years ago, somebody brought a lawsuit challenging mock checkpoints that pro-Palestinians put up to demonstrate what Palestinians have to go through in Israel. and they would stop kids and ask them, are you Jewish? Stand over here, to sort of reverse that. That has a clear political point of view, and a district court, when somebody presented with a claim that it created a hostile environment, said, no, that's protected speech. So there are some things that might, you could conceive of cases that might fall within the outer boundaries of the IRA definition, really the outer boundaries, that might be protected by the First Amendment. There are lots of things that aren't going to be protected by the First Amendment. And it's sort of hard to say in advance that the IRA definition will never raise a First Amendment case. I don't believe that to be true. Equally, and more importantly, it's not true that no application of IRA would be constitutional. So that's where we are. I should say one thing that I didn't make clear before. Title VI, its implementing regulations, requires universities to take steps to dispel a hostile environment. It's a mistake to think that the only thing you can do to satisfy, if you're a university and you don't want your federal funds cut off, the only thing you can do is throw a student out if somehow they say something that makes somebody uncomfortable. That's not the case with race. It's not the case. We know this from sex because there are lots more cases than that than any other area. And it's not true when it comes to the IRA definition. What the university has to do is dispel the hostile environment. That could consist of a statement by the university rejecting the statement. It could be a teach-in on why those sorts of claims are improper. There are all sorts of things universities can do which don't remotely impinge on the First Amendment. You have a right to speak, assuming I'm wrong about the checkpoints. So you put up a checkpoint. You assert a First Amendment right. University doesn't have to expel me in order to satisfy Title VI. It can say, these are very different situations. This is politically unfair, and we don't think it should take place on our campus. That probably would satisfy Title VI. So there's a good deal of room here to enforce the guts of of definition and Title VI without trenching on the First Amendment.
Well, Marc, I'm really glad that you mentioned the mock checkpoints, because my next question for Holly has to do with anti-Israel activity on campus and its relationship with IRA. Holly, I'm going to quote from the IRA definition, which again, tinyurl.com/working definition if you want to follow along. I'm going to quote the following. Manifestations of anti-Semitism might include the targeting of the state of Israel conceived as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. So this line, I think, is one of the lines that a lot of the controversy after the Trump executive order came out is coming from, because one interpretation of this is if you are conducting anti-Israel activity on campus, whether it's a mock checkpoint or some other manifestation, you are, per the IRA definition, engaging in anti-Semitic behavior. And so Holly, I'm wondering, per the IRA definition, is that, where do we draw the line here between something that is per IRA anti-Semitic and something that is not? It's just anti-Israel policy, anti-Israel rhetoric that doesn't fall under the category of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, it's absolutely, Zev. I think that is the question, right? Where is the line? There's actually not one answer, and it really all depends on context and intent, right? And the working definition and why it's such a useful tool is because it's actually very clear in saying that. So when we look at the 11 examples, so if you are following along and you want to actually visit the website with the IRA definition, there are 11 examples. 7 of the 11 actually have to do with Israel. But the IRA definition does not designate these examples as, ipso facto anti-Semitic. It actually says that these examples may serve as illustrations, and they could be examples taking into account the overall context. So this contextual assessment is actually, required under the definition, built into the definition. And so we need to exercise that, sound judgment in determining when the line is crossed. So with that very long disclaimer, yes, there are times when I think it has been crossed on college campuses, and I'll give a few examples. But again, like case-by-case basis context, looking at intent of the perpetrator, if you will. So when Jewish students are blamed for Israeli government decisions and policies, we can see that crossing into anti-Semitism. When mezuzahs are ripped off the door frames of Jewish students, or mock eviction notices are sent to Jewish students, but no one else, right, is receiving that. Like, this is not just anti-Israel criticism. This is actually attacking Jewish students for being Jewish, and maybe for their own connections with Israel. When a Jewish student is called a Zionist, where if you substituted the word Jew, where the Zionist was used, that code word, it would be an obvious anti-Semitic attack. When Jewish students are marginalized, or they're purposefully left out or called out because of their connections to Israel, in a way, and this is the key piece here, in a way that would never be allowed to happen to any other minority group, or whether it be African Americans or the LGBTQ community. It's this double standard, again, case-by-case basis, though. When Jewish institutions are vandalized in response to Israeli actions or policies. I'm thinking most recently of the University of Massachusetts Hillel House in Amherst, which was vandalized with the word Palestine in Arabic on Yom HaShoah, comes to mind, for instance. Now, whether that perpetrator themselves was an anti-Semite, I think we have to actually see that action is enabling anti-Semitism. It's enabling real anti-Semites, giving kind of power and credence to them. It's also hurting Jewish students. So in effect, that action can be anti-Semitic. And this also brings another point of just kind of the conflation of the Holocaust with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on campuses in general. I think several of you on the call are aware of the issue at Benedictine University when a Holocaust survivor was sharing his testimony and like the horrors of what he went through during the Holocaust, and a Students for Justice of Palestine Benedictine member, got up and said, can you disavow Israel because of the suffering of the Palestinians? And that conflation is entirely inappropriate to be making those connections. And then the last thing I'll say here is I think another manifestation of anti-Semitism actually has a little bit to do with the anti-normalization, movement, right? Like not letting Israelis or, Jewish students connect with Palestinians or Arabs on shared issues of even trying to promote peace. And this is actually one of the biggest barriers to peace, this anti-normalization movement. And I think specifically on the college campus, it can be a form of anti-Semitism because it renders collaboration impossible except on Palestinian terms, really disallowing Jews of any agency. So that's another point I would bring up. One more thing, actually, because I've seen this happen. There are times when the line has not been crossed, and yet we're quick to say that it has been crossed. And I think we really need to be careful to sure the charges are valid. We don't want to be throwing around this word anti-Semitism, right and left. We really want it to have power, and we want to use that word judiciously and use the IRA working definition judiciously as well, so it remains effective.
Thanks, Holly. And on the other side of that, if there is something that has undeniably crossed the line within the realm of anti-Israel activity, Marc, I'm wondering, are there either Title VI or the Trump executive order, or are there enforcement mechanisms here that would require universities to act beyond issuing a statement if something has absolutely crossed the line into anti-Semitism?
So you ran a couple of things together. Let me see if I can pull them apart. There is an enforcement mechanism. One can always file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education. To the extent that some states have adopted similar rules, or Florida, for example, then there may be state mechanisms as well. Most campuses have offices of equity where you at least want to give some thought to filing with them first. That's going to depend on the nature of the office and whether it's politicized or is a fair adjudicator. It's a mixed bag on university campuses. In general, what I would urge is that any student or group of students that encounters something that they think crosses the line, that they consult with somebody off campus who's not in the middle of the campus dispute, who can offer some guidance as to whether this is clearly enough over the line or clearly within the lines that it would be that either it invites a response or it's a mistake to bring another case that's going to be rejected. That's not easy. It's not easy when you're outside. It's even harder when you're in the middle. And finally, I have nothing against people resorting to lawyers. I think it's a wonderful thing. But people forget that sometimes, and I learned this very early in my career dealing with prisons, Jewish rights in prisons, sometimes the most effective and long-lasting changes come not from the outside, but when the institution itself is moved to respond. And so you have to give very serious consideration to going to the president or the provost or whomever and saying, look, as Holly said before, you would never tolerate this if it was about LGBTQ people or about African Americans or Hispanics or Native Americans. How come we're at fair game and you guys say nothing? Yeah, and sometimes that's the most effective thing you're going to get. First of all, it's faster. Department of Education is a couple of years behind, even though I think they've sped things up. You're talking a year or two. If you got a 4-year stay on campus and you're a junior, you'll never see the result of your complaint. Maybe if you're a freshman and you fail out and it takes you 8 years to finish, you might see a result. You can get the president to respond within a week. And that matters. You're only there 10 months a year. You're only there for 4 years. You ought to give that, even if it doesn't have the oomph of an order from the federal civil Department of Education, it's much faster. And for other people in the university, faculty and staff, what the president says has immediate impact, and they will respond to that. So you need to give very serious consideration of where your remedy lies and what you need that's acceptable. There will be cases where it's desirable to get a test case before the Department of Education, but they're few and far between. Most of them, a statement by the president, which has happened at least one university I can think of, where the president has made it very clear at every turn, it's campus with a lot of pro-Palestinian activity, that he will not tolerate the sort of stuff that violates IRA. That's much more effective than going to the Department of Education, where people have gone on that university and lost each time.
So Holly, if a lot of this is contextual and you have to take everything on a case-by-case basis, what's the value for a university or some sort of university body to be relying on the IRA definition of anti-Semitism as its reference point? And can you also speak to the countries and the police departments and the local governments that are utilizing the IRA definition? Can you speak to what the value add has been for having that reference point?
Yes, Deb, absolutely. I think first we have to understand, like on the college campus, that the definition very clearly is not meant to limit free speech. It's not meant to censor free speech. It's supposed to help us understand what anti-Semitism is, actually to give power to the victims to be able to explain otherwise unexplained forms of anti-Semitism. So I think on the campus space, and then I'll kind of back out into how governments and other entities are using the definition. If it's used properly, and again, this is the key piece, it's not meant to be a weapon or a blunt instrument. It's supposed to be a moldable tool. University administrators, faculty, and students can reference the definition when they're identifying possible instances of anti-Semitism. In the classroom, it can actually be used by faculty when discussing racism or prejudice. I think so often when we learn about anything related to Jewish history, it's often even seen through the lens of the Holocaust, and we somehow think that anti-Semitism has gone away, and this definition is actually very helpful in showing how it's actually not gone away, and it's rising because of these different forms. It can be used on the college campus space for data collection and monitoring, like keeping track of incidents happening on campus. Now, obviously, that's not going to necessarily infringe on free speech. The First Amendment protects those incidents happening. If they're not inciting violence, those incidents can still happen, but guess what? We now have a resource to look to determine what is anti-Semitic and what is not. It can also be used to determine whether those consistent incidences over and over again are creating that hostile environment for Jewish students, which Marc was referencing earlier. And I also think, you know, it can be used to encourage freedom of expression equally. And what do I mean by that? Because I think many of the people complaining against the use of the IRA definition are saying that, oh, it's chilling free speech, or, you know, we're not going to be able to freely express our ideas if we're protesting Israel. But I think on the same end, it's also the working definitions allowing for freedom of expression of Jewish students, and you know, that they can feature Israeli speakers and not have their events, you know, interrupted. It needs to go both ways, this freedom of expression piece. And we do you have a question?
No, I was going to add two things. One is, it's astounding how often, mostly faculty members will say, if we're criticized for our views on Israel, that has a chilling effect on speech. I always find it hysterical that tenured faculty somehow find their freedom of speech threatened when somebody criticizes them. But the definition, as Holly just said, by identifying something as a form of bias, makes it much easier, in theory at least, to call out people who are guilty of this without meeting this silly argument about you're chilling their speech. The other thing I can tell you as a general counsel of an organization is when you get a letter from somebody or a complaint from somebody that says, you know, I might write a letter to the newspaper if I don't like what you're doing. I'd probably take that letter and toss it in the garbage can. If, however, you sent me a letter that said, if you don't pay attention, I'm going to go to the government and they're going to cut off your government funding, and 30 or 40 or 50% of my budget comes from the government, I'm going to pay attention. I've got to respond, because otherwise you're going to the government and there's an audit, there's lots, which is a good thing for lawyers, but not for the university. So there's real power to that. It makes them, we were finding that our complaints were falling on deaf ears. And now they're not going to fall on deaf ears, because if we get that sort of response, we go to the government and try and stonewall the government.
Yeah, thank you, Marc, for that addition. That's very important, because I think when we look at how the definition's being used in the United States, because of our First Amendment laws, and also the executive order, it's very different than how our European counterparts, for instance, are using this definition, because, you know, their laws are different, and hate speech actually can be criminalized. Anti-Semitic hate speech can be criminalized. Holocaust denial can be criminalized. So even when we look to how the police, you know, in the UK, for instance, are using our working definition in their manuals and understanding what is anti-Semitism, what is not, like, it has an added piece to, like, the hate crimes that they're prosecuting. I think one of the biggest utilities of this definition is that it encompasses just the multifaceted nature of anti-Semitism today. You know, I think many on the outside will say, oh, it's just hatred of Jews. But what's so unique, I think, about the definition, anti-Semitism, the IRA definition, is that it actually starts out by saying anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews that may be translating, you know, as hatred of Jews, but it's that perception piece that can be connected to conspiracy theories, right? And, you know, other iterations. The working definition encompasses Holocaust denial and distortion, and the comparison of what Israelis are doing with what the Nazis are doing, and using the suffering of Jews and connecting it to the current political situation and that inappropriateness of this. And that's just so helpful, because most people don't recognize that all of these things are perceived as anti-Semitic by the majority of the Jewish community, and can have that in effect.
Thanks to both of you. We're now going to transition into Q&A, and we are getting a flood of questions coming in to campus@ajc.org. So if you have questions, now is the time to send those in. The first question is actually from AJC's CEO, David Harris. Marc and Holly, since the Trump executive order was issued, what's happened in the ensuing months? Has it been used? If so, why and to what end? So Marc, we'll start with you. What's been going on with VO since it came out?
Not much. There have been a couple of complaints that I know of. Department of Education does not publicize events, complaints, or make them available. So, but nothing much. There are a couple of older complaints, one involving Rutgers that was reopened well before the executive order, and that has not been processed. So not much, as far as I can see.
Do you anticipate that changing over the coming months, especially, I mean, right now with campuses being relatively empty, there's not a lot going on at actual college campuses right now, but do you anticipate that changing at all once students are returning to school?
I would expect that once campuses return, I think people who've been critical of the order will be looking for an opportunity to challenge its legality, is I think the next big possibility. And it reinforces what Holly was saying before about the need to be very careful here. You don't want to bring a case that's sort of hanging fruit for somebody who wants to challenge the order. And this is powerful medicine. We ought to use it where we need it and not in frivolous ways.
Another question we got from email, and Holly, I'm going to start with you on this one. Do you agree BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, and calling for the destruction of Israel are anti-Semitism? Or is everything, and then they put in quotes, contextual?
That's the easy way out, the contextual answer, which of course I'm going to say no. Let's unpack that a little bit. So, you know, AJC, we've done surveys like of American Jewish perceptions of what is anti-Semitism, of what is not, and I can refer us back to this landmark survey we did at the 1-year anniversary of Pittsburgh in October of 2019, and we found that 85% of American Jews would believe that the statement "Israel has no right to exist" as anti-Semitic. We know that when we've looked at the question, like, do you think like that BDS is Semitic? I think it was numbers like, 30%, or at least some of its members, were, et cetera. So it's not a uniform answer across the board, actually across the Jewish community. There's not like one answer, but I think what we have to look at, and so my answer might be complicated. No, I probably wouldn't say that the entire movement, that every person that's a BDS supporter is an anti-Semite. I wouldn't say that, and I think we need to make sure we don't say that. It's much more complicated, but we can look to the origins, right, of the movement, and the origins of the movement themselves actually will, kind of call for the right of return. They call for the destruction of the Jewish state as a Jewish state, and the founder, Barghouti, who it started this movement, has actually said as much. And so I think when we even look to the IRA definition about when you're questioning this Jewish state's right to exist, you're questioning Jews' self-determination in their homeland, like that's when you get into the elements of anti-Semitism.
Question coming in from email. Let's get down to brass tacks. If a student experiences what they think is anti-Semitism on campus, what concrete steps should they take? So they experience something immediately afterwards. What are they doing to address it?
If they're on a campus with a Hillel, I'd at least want to talk to the Hillel director. And again, that's because they will have had much more experience on a particular campus. They will know they likely will know the other individuals or groups involved, and then give you some guidance. Beyond that, it is going to vary. If the university president is readily available and it's a really outrageous thing, then maybe you go to the president. If it's closer to the line, then maybe you come to one of the national organizations and you say to them, is this something we should be pursuing? Can you help us? Can you offer us guidance? We have a pamphlet, which I think is still available, Zev, online, on your legal rights on campus. You ought to look at that and get some sense. There are other Jewish groups also available. But I know it looks like we're hiding behind the word context, but there's no avoiding it. If it's a fellow freshman makes a passing remark that nobody picks up on, and somebody disavows it on the spot, then I don't think there's much that needs to be done more. If it's at every public meeting of the freshman class, somebody gets up and makes an anti-Semitic comment, that's something else again. If it's a faculty member who makes it clear that no supporter of Israel is going to get a decent grade in his or her class, or as this happened, University of Michigan at Columbia Law School, you have faculty members who say, we won't write letters of recommendation for people to study in Israel. Those are different cases. It's impossible to cover them all here in this thing. What you shouldn't do is shrug your shoulders and say, oh, well, anti-Semitism has been around forever, so let it go. At the very least, for instance, there's a swastika in a bathroom stall. Okay, I don't know that that justifies a Title VI complaint to Washington, but at least you call the maintenance department until you paint the thing over, right? So there's a wide range of responses. It's going to depend on what we're talking about.
And I should take an opportunity here to note that if you are a student in college and you are experiencing something that you think might be anti-Semitism or is otherwise making you question whether or not this something has happened belongs on campus, please feel free to reach out to AJC. The campus@ajc.org email address is active long after this webinar, so please reach out and let us know, because this is what we do. So we're happy to work with you to work through that and possibly even put you in touch with Marc, but I don't want to volunteer.
That's a threat.
Sorry, Marc.
We're going to go back to some more questions from email. Can we, here's one. What is your perspective on professors who teach Middle East studies or other courses on about how Israel is an illegitimate colonizer and an irredeemable oppressor? So I'm gonna add to that. Like, does that kind of thing sound like it would end up in the realm of anti-Semitic activity, or is this differently problematic and still something that needs to be addressed?
So that is probably the very hardest question in this space, because at least amongst the professorate, what they say in the classroom, if it's at least remotely related to their subject, it's a different thing if a math teacher starts inveighing against Israel. But if they're teaching a Middle East course and they have a point of view, that is the sacred of sacred for the academics. And even people who are good friends of Israel in academia will rush to the defense most of the time of somebody who takes those views. The American Association of University Professors has a series of statements on this question, which don't really lead to a very satisfactory place. In theory, it's stated ground that you can't be punished for disagreeing with the professor. I didn't have the courage to disagree with professors on exams. When I taught in college and I told students that they didn't have to say what they thought I thought, and I would downgrade them for that, I nevertheless got answers that clearly reflected what they thought I thought. That's a very hard problem to deal with, and I've raised it with academics who are very friendly to Israel, and they say to me, yes, that's a real problem, and any cure is worse than the disease. So that's the very hardest problem. That doesn't mean that those professors should go unchallenged. It does mean that Title VI is probably not the route to do it in. There's another Title VI, to add to the confusion here, that deals with funding of Middle East studies. And that program, the Trump administration, to its great credit, and to the discredit of its predecessors, is taking seriously that it's got to be balanced. You can't use those federal monies to create a propaganda campaign against Israel. So that's a different Department of Education you have to go to. That's a very difficult issue that needs to be handled with extraordinary care, because if you do it wrong, you will find that even your friends abandon you. Holly, do you want to add anything?
You said what I was going to say about the counter speech piece. Even though the academics can say what they want in the classroom, that doesn't mean that what they're saying shouldn't go unchallenged. And I think that's when, Jewish students who feel like they can't say anything or who feel like their grades are going to be affected as such, we can seek outside help to support them in what they're seeing in the classroom. So that counter speech piece is very important.
Thanks. And again, this is an area where AJC, outside of our webinar work, is really working with students to help navigate challenging issues inside the classroom, on the quad, and really get to a place where, if nothing else, at least there is productive dialogue and not a culture of targeting and hatred. I know we're running close on time here. I did want to ask this other question we got from the email. Even though a court has ruled otherwise, I have never understood the argument that mock checkpoints that are directed specifically at and used as a vehicle to harass Jewish students are not problematic under Title VI, to say nothing of anti-Semitism. What am I missing? So Marc, we talked about this a little bit earlier.
The First Amendment doesn't tolerate as a broad principle the idea that you can suppress speech because it makes people uncomfortable. This is a bedrock of our free speech doctrine. It is challenged nowadays by those who think hate speech should be criminalized. That's true. But the doctrine, which the Supreme Court has twice now in the last 4 years in a very different context, copyright and trademark, unanimously, every justice of the court agreed that hate speech is protected. The fact that it makes people uncomfortable is not grounds for government suppression writ large. University campus is a little bit different, as is the employment field, because you sort of have to be there. But the fact that you're uncomfortable is not itself an exception to the First Amendment. In addition, if you look at the actual, what the courts say, some ambiguity, but basically to constitute a hostile environment, it has to be, the speech or the conduct has to be severe, pervasive, either or, and objectively unreasonable. Some question about the last conjunction. And I don't know that the checkpoints meet that standard. And if they don't meet that standard, they don't violate Title VI. If you put something like that up before the Hillel every Friday night and every Saturday for services, maybe we could talk about severe, pervasive, and objectively unreasonable. But an occasional checkpoint with a fairly clear political purpose, I think is not, in most cases, going to be found to be severe, pervasive, and objectively unreasonable, and therefore it doesn't violate Title VI.
And Marc, even if it is, let me just understand this correctly, even if it is anti-Semitic, even if like the people holding those checkpoints actually have the intent to, hurt Jewish students. I mean, we do know that, anti-Zionists in general have more tendencies to believe in anti-Semitic statements as well. So let's say even that there were an anti-Semitic case within that checkpoint, it's still legal within the First Amendment because it's anti-Semitism protects it.
If somebody, I mean, again, back to context, if the people manning the checkpoint are holding signs that say the Nazis were right, they just didn't finish the job, that would change the nature of the demonstration. If the people, as has happened on some campuses, which I don't think is protected by First Amendment, if they physically interfered with people going, if they caught people with yarmulkes and they stopped them from physically stopped them from going to class, that again would not probably be protected by the First Amendment. The mere fact that somebody has a checkpoint on campus and you have to walk by it, as I say, with the only court decision we have, relatively easily dismissed any claim that violated Title VI as protected speech. And I think that's probably the way most courts would come out. I think ultimately that's how the Department of Education is going to come out.
Thank you.
I think we can squeeze in one more question from email. Holly, a student is writing and asking, should the IRA definition be adopted by our student government associations on campus? I think this is an especially pertinent question considering that earlier this academic year, there was a whole debacle at the University of Illinois where the student government attempted to pass a resolution, or did pass a resolution, attempting to define anti-Semitism, and in that definition, which is very different than the IRA working definition, noted that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are two completely separate things that never overlap. So keeping that in mind, is there value, do you think, in having student governments pursue our adoption of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism?
That's a great question. There's value in the definition being used. Right? Being used by students, being used by faculty, being used by administrators to understand what anti-Semitism is, even if it doesn't have a formal adoption. Sometimes, and I can speak to some cases actually in Europe, we're trying to get this formal adoption, right? They're trying to get all sorts of countries to vote and agree. actually did a disservice to the definition because people were trying to, fighting over wording, figuring this out. And it's become so politicized, unfortunately, now in our climate. I think actually people really misunderstand the definition's intent. I've actually read some crazy criticisms to where I don't even think they've actually read the definition. So sometimes I think this is, again, it's a case-by-case basis. It's not going to be on every campus this way, but the bigger fight might just be starting to use it at the grassroots level, starting to, and not having that formal adoption to bring more undue attention to it. We want it to be implemented, we wanted it to be used. So kind of using your own judgment on whether you think it would actually do a disservice to have it being formally voted on.
I mean, I would add, a mentor of mine once told me in a somewhat similar case, when you shoot for the king, you have to shoot to kill. And if you're going to introduce this at student government and you lose, or you get, you win by 52%, but 48% of the students think that the definition is suppressing freedom of speech, on a definition that's anyway part of our law because Department of Education has said so, I'm not sure you've done anybody a service. And let alone if you lose, that sends a message to administrators, this is going to be hugely unpopular to enforce. I'm not sure that I see an advantage there, but I would defer to Holly on the merits, but that's what I would say.
So in our last minute here, at AJC, we talk to a lot of students. The overwhelming majority of students that we talk to and that are involved with AJC's work tell us that the experience for Jewish students on campus overall is incredibly positive. Jewish students are having great experiences on campus and Shabbat dinners and Jewish programs on campus. We spent most of the last hour talking about the moments where that's not true. In about 30 seconds, can each of you give me or give our audience something to look forward to, you think, in this realm, something positive or something that makes
graduation.
Besides graduation, something else that you're optimistic about working in this space with students?
I'll start, Mark. So I'm not Jewish. I'm a Christian, and I actually do teach at an undergraduate Christian university in Santa Barbara, a liberal arts college called Westmont. And I taught a class last semester, an entire semester, on anti-Semitism, from the history to how it manifests today, what can be done about it. And I had 22 Christian students taking this class who wanted to know, what does it mean to, as a non-Jewish student, to be active in this fight? And that is a good news story.
Thanks, Holly. Mark?
I think I had a son who graduated school a couple of years ago from Columbia, at a time when some people were saying Columbia was the most anti-Semitic university in the United States. I graduated there 40 some odd years ago. My experiences were friendly. I had no real problems, but his were much friendlier. Jews were, there was a Hillel building, there was kosher food at every event. And there's a lot of good news. There's a lot of Jewish activity. It's fine, it's unimpeded by all this. And we shouldn't always be looking for the bad news. I think there's a lot of good news. We have a lot of friends on campus, a lot of friends in administration, and we should not take the occasional bump and turn it into Mount Everest.
Thanks, Mark. And thank you to everybody who tuned in today on Zoom and on Facebook. Our AJC Campus Crash Course continues. Please look at ajc.org/advocacy anywhere for more information about future webinars and other programs that we're doing. And our work on college campuses is certainly ongoing even during this pandemic time. So please be in touch with us, campus@ajc.org. The email address works long after this webinar is over. We're happy to have a conversation about what's going on with you on your campus. Thank you to Mark and Holly, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. Have a good rest of your day. Take care.